Bwgan St Andrews, it's Miss Thomas here with today's pre-recorded session. I'm going to continue reading our class novel, Who's Afraid of the Bwgan-Wood? Chapter 10, Kidnapped. Tatty and Dio were finding it difficult to get away from Derwin's house without hurting his feelings. Derwin loved having visitors, and now that the summer was over and his rowan trees were falling asleep, he was a bit lonely. Out of politeness, the two Bwgan-Wood had to stay for a cup of strawberry cordial and freshly baked scones spread with blackberry jelly. "When am I going to see this show of yours then?" Derwin wanted to know. "Haven't been to a Nos and Lawen in years." Next week, I think," said Tatty. "We'll let you know in plenty of time. We just wanted to borrow your butterflies to practice with." Before they left, Derwin gave Tatty a present, a circlet of rowan berries and golden leaves to wear on her head. It was very pretty. As they flew back into the wood, the sunlight was fading. They saw Warren and Ellery hurrying back towards the waiting bus, and the teacher coming down the lane to meet them. "I've seen those two somewhere before, haven't I?" said Tatty. "Butcher's friends, I think," said Dio. "They were in Essel's quarry earlier on. Wonder what they were doing in our wood." It didn't take them long to find out. The glade around the Bwgan house was in an uproar. Nino was wringing her hands and crying. Tide was stomping about and shouting terrible threats while trying to comfort Nino at the same time. The Bwgan house itself was incoherent with rage and grief. "Where were you?" everybody shrieked when they saw Tatty and Dio. For a few minutes, Tatty and Dio couldn't make any sense out of what the others were saying, except for the fact that Bwgan Babi was missing. "But he can't have gone far," Tatty said. "He can't fly yet, and everybody round here knows him." It was then that the Bwgan house finally managed to convey to them what had actually happened. "Kidnapped!" gasped Dio. He and Tatty stared at one another, utterly appalled. If they hadn't sneaked off to Derwin's house. Nino was blaming herself just as much. "Oh, if I hadn't gone to sleep!" And the Bwgan house was sunk in a terrible dejection which made it quite clear to everybody that it blamed itself most of all. "And what your mammy and daddy are going to say when they come home, I daren't think," Nino sobbed. In a flash, Tatty remembered the two human children they'd seen scurrying towards the bus, the boy carrying the tin box, and the girl limping and holding her side. "Come on," she said to Dio. Leaving Derwin's precious butterflies with Nino and Tide, they flew to the farm. But the yard was empty. The buses had gone. When the bus reached the school, it was nearly 4:15. All the parents were waiting outside. They looked worried and cross. The teachers hustled the children inside and into the nature room. "Right, thanks to Ellery Hughes, we won't have time to sort anything out this afternoon. Put all your boxes and specimens and notebooks on the table. We'll look at them in the morning. Ellery, where are you going with that tin?" "Sir, I've got to take it home. It's got "I'm sure your mother won't mind if it stays here until tomorrow. Just leave it on the table with the others." "But sir, there's a..." "Come on, Ellery, don't be silly. Whatever's inside will be perfectly all right until the morning. It's all going back to the wood tomorrow anyway." And he took the cake tin from Ellery's hands and put it on the top of the pile. Then he shooed everybody out and locked the nature room door. Since the break-in, all the inside doors were locked at night, as well as the outside ones. Hilary was frantic. Tears welled up in her eyes and trickled down her face. She grabbed the teacher's sleeve. "But sir, there's a baby in it, a real live baby." The teacher had had quite enough of Hilary for one day. He was trying to listen to a dozen other people at the same time and answer all their questions. And as far as he was concerned, Hilary was just being silly again. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Hilary," he snapped. "Right, you lot, everybody out. Your parents have been waiting for half an hour already. I'll answer all your questions in the morning." Hilary was beginning to learn that the trouble with being silly and scatterbrained most of the time was that when a real emergency turned up, nobody paid any attention to anything you said. She was unusually silent in the car on the way home. Bethan and Sally Ann made up for it by chattering 19 to the dozen, so Sally Ann's mother didn't notice. At home, the television was on and her mother was making her tea. "What's the matter, love?" her mother asked when Hilary didn't seem to want to eat. Just a bit tired, that's all," Hilary said. Then, in case her mother started asking awkward questions, she added hastily, "Oh, we had a smashing time though." After tea, her mother bustled away to give their baby his bath. Hilary sat in front of the television and tried desperately to think of a way of rescuing the fairy baby and taking him back to the wood. She'd had plenty of time by now to imagine how her mother would feel if somebody kidnapped their baby. The very idea made her feel sick inside. Perhaps the fairy baby was getting hungry and cold and wet in his tin box. Perhaps he was frightened at being left all alone in the dark. Perhaps he was crying. Hilary got up. She had to tell somebody what had happened. There was no point in trying to explain things to her mother or her father. They simply wouldn't believe her. They'd think she was coming down with flu or the measles or something and sent her straight to bed. Even Warren hadn't been able to see the baby. The only person she could think of who might just listen was David from next door. She tiptoed into the hall and put on her coat and woolly cap. Then she let herself out the back door, closing it very quietly behind her. Miraculously, David was outside in the garden shed feeding his rabbits. "Hello, what was the nature walk like?" Hilary burst into tears. Between hiccups and sobs, she told David about the kidnapping. In spite of being the youngest, David was in some ways the most sensible of all the Moss-and-Close children. He knew perfectly well just how dopey and scatty Hilary could be, and how she loved to make up weird stories. But this story he could tell was different. Hilary was really frightened and very upset. All at once, he remembered the pale, misty shapes they'd seen in the old ironworks, and the eerie laughter. "Honestly, Hilary," he said severely, "you need your head read. Picking up a baby like that and running off with it. What a daffy thing to do." Hilary's tears dried up like somebody turning a tap off at the mains. "You believe me?" "Course I do." David thought for a bit and then said hopefully, "Perhaps it's magicked itself out of that box by now and gone back home." "It was so small though," Hilary said. "What if it couldn't? I mean, we can walk and talk, but babies can't." David was already wearing his coat and scarf. The evening had turned frosty again and the shed was cold. "Only one way to find out. We'll go back to the school and tell Mr. Johnson your mam needs the cake tin. Come on." Outside, it was getting dark. The street lights were coming on in a long string down the main road. David and Hilary scuttled off round the corner of Mostyn Close, hoping that nobody would see them, or worse still, stop them to ask them where they were going. Tatty and Dio had called in at the estate once already to look for Butcher. He wasn't there, so they'd flown to the school. By then, of course, all the children had gone home. Now they were on their way back to Mostyn Close in the hope that Butcher might be available and able to help. On the main road, they spotted two small figures hurrying towards the town. "It's them! One of them," Dio said. "The other one was bigger." "One's enough. Come on." David and Hilary came to an abrupt, terrified halt. Their hearts did backflips and their knees turned to jelly. Two misty, purple-haloed figures were hovering right in front of them, blocking their path. The figures had enormous green eyes and pointed ears, and they both looked furiously angry. "What have you done with our baby?" Tatty snarled. Hilary couldn't speak. Her mouth opened and shut, but no sound came out. "Well?" snapped Dio. In the school," Hilary croaked. David's heart had started beating again, very fast, with wonder and excitement. He forgot to be afraid. Bwgan-Wood did exist, after all, and he, David Williams, was talking to them. "We can see you," he said joyfully. Tatty was a bit taken aback. "So?" "That's the whole point," David explained. Nobody else could see the baby except Hilary, and she didn't mean to steal it. She was just playing with it. And then something horrible came out of them, and Warren picked up the tin and they ran away. Hilary didn't even know Warren had the tin until they got into the bus, and then it was too late. Nobody would listen to her, and she's been worried sick. We're going back to the school now to see if Mr. Johnson will let us have the tin back." "I did think about stealing it," Hilary admitted truthfully, "but then I knew it would be wrong. I was going to put the baby back on the grass where I'd found it, only there wasn't time. I was just being silly. I promise I'll never be silly ever again." David looked a bit sceptical at this, but didn't say anything. Tatty glared severely at Hilary. "We've been worried sick too," she said. I know," said Hilary in a small voice, "and I'm sorry, I really am." "OK, let's not waste any more time," said Dio, taking charge. "Back to the school. You'll have to come with us," he told the children, "to talk to this Mr. Johnson person." They hurried down the road in the gathering dust, the two human children running and trotting in turns, and the two Bwgan-Wood floating effortlessly alongside. "Can't you go any faster?" Dio said unkindly. No, Hilary panted. "We're doing our best." David was dying to ask the Bwgan-Wood all sorts of questions about themselves, but he was soon too breathless to speak. But when they got there, the primary school was empty and dark. Mr. Johnson and the cleaners had locked up and gone home. David and Hilary collapsed in a heap on the front steps, feeling sick with disappointment. Tatty and Dio flew round the school looking for an open window or even a fairly wide crack in a door. But since the break-in, every single window had been fitted with special locks and was securely shut. The door panels had been replaced with strengthened glass, which had wire netting inside it. They peered through the window of the nature room. They could all see the cake tin on the table because of the lights of the estate. It sat there, surrounded by other boxes and plastic bags and branches of rowan. "Even the little classroom window is locked," Tatty said miserably. David was puzzled. "You mean you've been here before?" "Once, Dio said, and in spite of their worries, the Bwgan-Wood exchanged a private grin. And then all four of them froze, because now they could hear faintly but distinctly the sound of Bwgan-Babi crying. Eleri went cold inside. What about the keyholes? David suggested. Dio shook his head. Metal, he explained. We daren't touch iron. It makes us helpless. We can't disappear or change shape or anything. In fact, the whole school was like an iron cage, and Bwgan-Babi himself was inside another one, because tins, of course, are made of steel with a coating of tin inside, and steel is made of iron. Even if the Bwgan-Wood had managed to wriggle in through a crack, they wouldn't have been able to do anything without human help. In sheer desperation, David picked up a stone and hurled it with all his strength at the window of the nature room. It bounced off, making the whole window shiver. Plate glass, he said. We'll need an axe to smash that. Where does this Mr. Johnson live? Asked Tatty, but David and Eleri didn't know. On the estate somewhere, Eleri said. We could go round and ask. Trouble is, David said unhappily, nobody'd believe us. He made a face. There'd be an awful fuss, and they probably wouldn't open up the school anyway. Tatty and Dio and Eleri knew exactly what he meant. It wasn't difficult to imagine the scene. Mr. Johnson coming to the door in his shirt sleeves and slippers, annoyed at being disturbed like this, curt and suspicious. The school? What do you want to go to the school for at this time of night? Do your parents know where you are? And then the phone calls. Fathers arriving in cars, angry and puzzled, asking too many questions and not believing any of the answers. All four of them shuddered. I could try and steal an axe, David offered, looking across at the backyards and gardens of the estate. They've got alarm bells, Eleri said, surprised at herself for remembering. Mum's in the PTA. They had a collection after the break-in. Her eyes went wide and horrified. They'll put us in jail. Tatty and Dio flew round the school once more to see if they'd missed any possible way in. Any luck? Said Eleri hopefully when they returned. Dio shook his head. My nan saw Bwgan-Wood once, Eleri said. She'd have helped us, only she's away in Wolverhampton with my Auntie Ellen. And Gramps couldn't have helped, even if he'd been at home instead of in hospital. Oh, it's no good, Tatty said despairingly. We're going to need big magic for this. Let's go and see Dewin again. Dio thought that was the best suggestion anybody'd made all evening. David got up from where he'd been sitting. He was cold and stiff and tired. I suppose we'd better go home then, he said glumly. Dio looked at the two shivering human children. They were all right once you got to know them. Might as well, he said kindly. You've done all you could. It's up to Tatty and me from now on. Thanks for helping anyway, said Tatty. Will you let us know what happens? Eleri asked anxiously. The Bwgan-Wood nodded. If you want us for anything, David said, you know where we live. And rather forlornly, he and Eleri began the long walk home. I hope you enjoyed the next chapter of the book and look forward to sharing what happens next in another session next week. Keep up all the hard work you're doing at home. Keep safe, and I'll see you soon. Da bo chi!